"I can cure your mother, but first you need to save mine," said the poor boy to the millionaire. Richard Anderson was exhausted after another sleepless night in the waiting room of Mercy General Hospital in Chicago. His mother, Mrs. Eleanor, had been hospitalized for 3 weeks, and the doctors couldn't explain why she had simply stopped speaking and moving, as if she had given up on life. That's when a boy in simple, slightly dirty clothes approached him in the hallway. The child couldn't have been more than 12, with messy brown hair and eyes that seemed to carry far more experience than his age suggested. "You're the son of the lady in room 312, right?" the boy asked, sitting beside Richard without asking for permission. Richard looked at him irritably. How did this child know where his mother was? And why wasn't he in school? "Who are you, kid? What do you want?" he replied sharply, not hiding his exhaustion. "My name is Jack Peter, but everyone calls me JP. I work here, well, my mum does. She's a cleaner." The boy paused, studying Richard carefully. "I know what's wrong with your mother." "You? A kid knows what the best doctors in Chicago can't figure out?" Richard shook his head, ready to stand up. "She's not sick in her body, mister. She's sick in her soul." JP spoke softly, but with a certainty that made Richard freeze mid-motion. "I can cure your mother, but first, you need to save mine." Richard turned fully toward the boy, really listening to his words for the first time. There was something in the child's voice that unsettled and intrigued him at once. "What are you talking about?" JP took a deep breath before answering. "Your mother found out something that hurt her real bad, didn't she? Some old family secret. That's why she stopped talking. I've seen it before." The boy paused, seeing he'd hit the mark by the shock on Richard's face. "My grandma always said when the pain in your soul gets too big, your body shuts down. It's protection." A chill ran down Richard's spine. How could this boy know that? Mrs. Eleanor had discovered, through old documents in the attic, that her late husband had had an affair 40 years ago, and that she had a stepson she'd never met. The revelation had devastated her. "That's impossible. You can't know that." "I know because my mom's been cleaning this hospital for 15 years. She taught me to watch people, and because I've been through it myself." JP looked down for a moment. "When I found out my dad was never coming back, I couldn't walk right for 3 months. My legs just wouldn't listen." The sincerity in the boy's voice made Richard sit back down. For the first time in weeks, someone was talking about his mother's condition in a way that made sense. "And how did you get better?" "My grandma Barbara taught me. She took care of people her whole life before she started working here at the hospital. New things doctors don't learn in school." JP looked Richard straight in the eye. "But she passed last year. Before she went, she taught me everything she knew." Richard shook his head, still skeptical. "Look, kid, I get that you want to help, but your mother likes old music, doesn't she? Especially those romantic songs from the 60s? JP interrupted. "And there's a ring she always twists on her finger when she's nervous?" Richard froze. Those details were far too personal for a stranger to know. "How do you—" "Because I pay attention. I'm here every day after school waiting for my mom to finish her shift. I've seen your mother a lot. She'd always stand by the window in her room, looking at the garden, twisting that ring, and whispering to herself." JP paused. "Until 3 weeks ago when she stopped doing everything." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. "You said I need to save your mother first. What does she need?" Richard asked, his voice softer now. JP took a deep breath, as if it were hard to talk about. "My mom, Mrs. Margaret, is losing her eyesight. She has diabetes but can't afford her medicine properly. Sometimes she goes days without taking it because there's no money." The words spilled out quickly, as if he wanted to get it all out at once. "And now we're losing our home. The landlord wants us out because we haven't paid rent in 3 months. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. He'd spent weeks thinking only about his own problems, but here was a child carrying responsibilities no adult should have to bear. "Where do you live?" "In Hope Village, near the train station. It's far from here, but my mom insists on working at this hospital because it's the best in the area. She says she's proud of her work." JP wiped his nose with his shirt sleeve. But if she loses her sight, she won't be able to work anymore. And then you won't have any way to support yourselves, Richard finished. Yeah, JP whispered in confirmation. That's why I learned everything my grandma taught me. Someone has to take care of my mum when she can't anymore. Richard studied the boy for a few seconds. There was a maturity in him that didn't match his age, but also a determination that impressed him. And you really believe you can help my mother? I know I can, but it's not just about massages or home remedies. JP turned to him seriously. It's about making her remember who she is, all the good she's lived. Sometimes we get so focused on the pain that we forget the joy. Richard thought for a long moment. He'd spent a fortune on the best specialists in the city, and none had even managed to get his mother to open her eyes. What did he have to lose by trying? If I help your mother, do you really think you can help mine? I'm sure of it, JP answered without hesitation. But it has to be today. The eviction is tomorrow morning. Richard heard the urgency in the boy's voice and made a decision that would change everything. All right, let's see what we can do. JP smiled for the first time since he'd approached, and Richard realized how completely that smile transformed the boy's face. Thank you, Uncle Richard. I promise you won't regret it. How do you know my name? I heard the nurses talking. JP stood up, extending his small hand to Richard. Can we go now? My mom's shift ends at 5 and I wanted you to meet her first. Richard checked his watch. It was 4:15 p.m. He took the boy's hand, surprised by the firmness of his grip, and the two walked through the hospital corridors. JP, can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you decide to help me? You don't even know me. The boy stopped walking for a moment, thoughtful. Because I saw the way you look at your mother. It's the same way I look at mine. He started walking again. And my grandma always said that when you have the chance to do good, you can't let it pass, because there might not be another. They went down to the hospital basement, where the locker rooms and cleaning supplies were kept. The atmosphere was very different from the upper floors, simpler, with pale green walls and flickering fluorescent lights. Mom always stays here organizing supplies before she leaves, JP explained as they walked. When they reached the end of the hallway, Richard saw a woman around 40 years old, her black hair tied in a simple bun, wearing the light blue uniform of the cleaning staff. She had her back to them, arranging some supplies in a cabinet. Mom? JP called softly. The woman turned and Richard could see her eyes were slightly clouded, confirming what the boy had said about her vision. JP, what are you doing down here, son? She noticed Richard beside the boy and grew visibly nervous. Good afternoon, sir. Is there a problem? Mom, this is Mr. Richard. Remember I told you about the lady in room 312? Mrs. Margaret nodded, still unsure where this was going. This is her son, JP continued, and I offered our help. JP, Mrs. Margaret scolded, clearly embarrassed. I'm sorry, sir. My son sometimes... No need to apologize. Richard interrupted kindly. Your son told me about your situation and how he thinks he can help my mother. Mrs. Margaret looked from JP to Richard, trying to understand what was happening. Sir, I don't know what this boy told you, but we don't ask for help from anyone. We've always managed on our own. I know, and I admire that, Richard replied sincerely. But sometimes accepting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. JP stepped closer to his mother and took her hand. Mom, Mr. Richard can help us with the medicine and the rent, and I can help his mother. Everyone wins. Mrs. Margaret shook her head, her eyes welling up. Son, things aren't that simple. Why not? Richard asked, genuinely curious. Because Mrs. Margaret hesitated, as if struggling to put it into words. Because people like you don't usually mix with people like us. And when they do, there's always something behind it. The brutal honesty of Mrs. Margaret's words hit Richard hard. She was right. In his entire life, he'd never even spoken to a cleaning lady for more than 2 minutes. You're right, Richard admitted. I've never done this before. But that's exactly why I need to do it now. What do you mean? Richard thought for a moment before answering. My mother always taught me that life is about exchanges, not just money, but experiences, knowledge, care. He looked at JP. Your son has something I need, and I have something you need. Why can't we just trade? Mrs. Margaret stayed silent for a few seconds, studying Richard's face as if trying to decipher his true intentions. What exactly are you proposing? First, we'll settle the rent and medicine. That's easy for me. Richard paused. In return, JP teaches me everything he knows about helping people going through hard times, and we try to help my mother together. What if it doesn't work with your mother? Then at least I tried something different, and you'll be free from financial worries for a while to focus on your health. JP looked anxiously between them, clearly hoping his mother would agree. Mom, please, let me try to help, he begged quietly. Mrs. Margaret took a deep breath. All right, but on one condition. What? Richard asked. If there's no improvement in your mother after a week, you stop this and leave us alone. I don't want dependence or false hope. Richard extended his hand to her. Deal. When Mrs. Margaret shook Richard's hand, he felt how rough it was from work, but also how firm and honest her grip was. Then let's start right now, JP said, excited for the first time that day. The three of them walked back together to the floor where Mrs. Eleanor was staying. In the elevator, Richard took the chance to learn more about their story. JP told me you live in Hope Village. How long? Since he was born, Mrs. Margaret answered. Before that, I lived with my mother-in-law downtown, but when he left, I had to move to a cheaper place. Richard noticed how she had avoided giving details about her husband and decided not to press the matter. And have you always worked here at the hospital? Always. I started as a general helper, then became responsible for cleaning the private rooms. There was pride in her voice. 15 years without a single complaint from patients. My mom says Mrs. Margaret is the best employee at the hospital, JP added. Everyone likes her. The elevator stopped on the 3rd floor, and they walked to room 312. Before entering, Richard turned to them. Before we see my mother, I need to tell you what happened. Why she's like this. Mrs. Margaret and JP listened as Richard explained about finding the documents in the attic, his father's affair, and the existence of a half-brother no one knew about. When she found out, it was like her world collapsed, Richard concluded. 40 years of marriage, and she realized she never truly knew the man she lived with. JP shook his head, thoughtful. It's like what happened to me when I found out my dad had another family. He glanced at his mother, who lowered her eyes. I also felt like our whole life had been a lie. And how did you get past it? Richard asked. My grandma explained that people do wrong things, but that doesn't erase the good they've done too. JP reflected for a moment. My dad may have left, but he taught me to ride a bike, took me to the circus, played with me. Those things are still true. The simplicity and depth of the boy's words struck Richard. Do you think my mother can understand that? I do. But first, she needs to feel she's not alone. JP looked at the door. Can I see her? Richard opened the door slowly. The room was spacious and bright, with a modern hospital bed and machines monitoring Mrs. Eleanor's vitals. She lay still, staring at the ceiling. Mom? Richard approached the bed. I brought some people who wanted to meet you. Mrs. Eleanor didn't respond or move, but her eyes shifted slightly toward her son's voice. JP stepped forward carefully, not wanting to startle her. Good afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor. My name is Jack Peter. I'm your son's friend. For the first time, Mrs. Eleanor's eyes focused on something specific, the boy's face. Can I sit here beside you? JP asked, pointing to a chair by the bed. Richard was surprised when his mother gave an almost imperceptible nod, which he took as a yes. JP sat down and spent a few minutes just quietly observing Mrs. Eleanor. Richard grew impatient, but Mrs. Margaret held his arm, signaling him to wait. You have beautiful eyes, JP finally said, just like your son's, and I bet when you smile they get even prettier. Mrs. Eleanor blinked a few times as if processing his words. "My grandma always said eyes are the window to the soul," JP continued, his voice soft and soothing. "And from yours I can tell you have a very strong soul. You're just tired right now." Richard saw a tear roll down his mother's face, the first emotion she'd shown in weeks. "It's okay to be tired, Mrs. Eleanor." JP leaned a little closer. "Everyone gets tired when they realize the people we love are also human and make mistakes." Mrs. Eleanor's breathing shifted slightly, growing deeper. "But you know what my grandma taught me, that when someone hurts us, we can choose between two things. Let the pain take over everything, or use the pain to understand people's hearts better." JP paused, observing Mrs. Eleanor's reaction. "The man who was married to you did something wrong, that's true. But for the 40 years you were together, I bet he did a whole lot of right things too. And you know what they were because you were there to see them." This time, more tears streamed down Mrs. Eleanor's face. "Would you like to try remembering something good?" JP asked gently. To everyone's surprise, Mrs. Eleanor nodded more clearly. A definite yes. "Great. Then close your eyes and think about the first time the man who was your husband made you laugh. Right at the beginning, when you were young." Richard watched, fascinated, as his mother's face gradually relaxed. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, her expression wasn't twisted in pain. "Now remember what your laughter sounded like back then. Let that laughter fill your chest again." Richard could have sworn he saw the hint of a smile at the corner of his mother's lips. "Very good, Mrs. Eleanor," JP smiled. "Now you can keep that memory close to your heart. It's yours and no one can take it from you." Mrs. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked straight at JP. For the first time since she'd discovered the documents, there was life in her gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, so softly it was almost inaudible. Richard felt as if the world had stopped. His mother had spoken. After 3 weeks of complete silence, she had spoken. "You're welcome, Mrs. Eleanor," JP replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Would you like to try sitting up a little?" Mrs. Eleanor nodded, and with great effort, began pushing herself up on her arms to sit in bed. Richard rushed to help her, adjusting the pillows behind her back. "How do you feel, Mom?" Richard asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Tired," she answered, but her voice was stronger now. "But better." Mrs. Margaret, who had been standing at the back of the room observing everything, stepped forward. "Mrs. Eleanor, my name is Margaret. It's a pleasure to meet you." Mrs. Eleanor studied Mrs. Margaret's face for a few seconds. "How you work here at the hospital?" "Yes, I do. I'm in charge of cleaning this floor." "I remember you," Mrs. Eleanor said slowly. "You always hummed softly when you cleaned my room. Old songs." Mrs. Margaret smiled, surprised she'd noticed. "You always seemed to like it. That's why I kept singing." "I did. It reminded me of my youth." Richard was too emotional to speak. In less than an hour, JP had made more progress with his mother than weeks of medical treatment. "JP, how did you know what to do?" Richard finally asked. "My grandmother always said that when you're hurting deep inside, you need to remember that not everything in life is pain," JP explained. "Sometimes you just need someone to help you find the light again." Mrs. Eleanor looked at the boy intently. "How old are you?" 12, Mum. 12 years old and already knows these things. I learned because I had to," JP replied simply. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, continuing. Mrs. Eleanor gently stroked JP's hair. "Your grandmother taught you well, young man. She said all suffering can turn into wisdom if we let it." Richard watched the interaction between his mother and the boy, amazed at how natural it seemed, as if they'd known each other for years. "Mum, JP and Mrs. Margaret are going through some difficulties," Richard said. "I'd like to help them, if you'll allow it." Mrs. Eleanor looked questioningly at Richard. "What kind of difficulties?" Mrs. Margaret hesitated, but JP answered directly. "My mother is losing her sight because of diabetes and we can't afford the medication properly, and we're going to lose our house tomorrow because we don't have money for rent." Mrs. Eleanor stayed silent for a few seconds, processing the information. "Richard, can you handle this?" "I can, Mom, easily. Then handle it, she said firmly. That boy gave me back my voice. It's the least we can do. Richard smiled, happy to see his mother showing interest in something for the first time in weeks. I was already planning to do it, Mum. And it's not just for what he did for me, Mrs. Eleanor continued, looking at Mrs. Margaret. It's because it's the right thing to do. You raised me to know that. Mrs. Margaret had tears in her eyes. Mrs. Eleanor, you don't have to... Yes, I do, Mrs. Eleanor interrupted. I need to remember how good it feels to help people. It makes you feel human again. Richard took out his phone and called his personal assistant. Charles, it's me. I need you to handle something urgent. He stepped away briefly to give instructions about paying the overdue rent and purchasing the medication. While Richard was on the phone, JP approached Mrs. Eleanor again. Mrs. Eleanor, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. Have you forgiven your husband? The question caught Mrs. Eleanor off guard. She thought for a long moment before answering. I don't know if I can forgive him yet. It hurts too much. That's okay. You don't have to forgive him today, JP said understandingly. But maybe you can start forgiving yourself. What do you mean? Sometimes we get mad at ourselves for believing in someone, for loving someone who hurt us, JP spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. But loving someone is never foolish, even when they don't deserve it. Mrs. Eleanor fell silent, reflecting on the boy's words. You're very wise for just 12 years old. My grandma used to say wisdom doesn't come from age. It comes from what we do with life's hardships. Richard returned, putting his phone away. Done. There'll be no eviction tomorrow morning, and the medication will arrive today at the pharmacy near your house. Mrs. Margaret began to cry, covering her face with her hands. I can't believe this is happening. JP hugged his mother from the side, and Richard was moved by the sincere gratitude in both their eyes. No need to thank me, Richard said. You've given me far more than I could ever give you. What do you mean? Mrs. Margaret asked, drying her tears. You reminded me of who I really am. Richard looked at his mother, who was smiling for the first time in weeks. Or rather, who I should be. Mrs. Eleanor reached out her hand to Richard, who held it tenderly. Your father would be proud, son. Richard felt a lump in his throat hearing that. Even after everything we found out about him. Especially after everything we found out, Mrs. Eleanor replied, because you're choosing to be better than he was, and that's what truly matters. JP walked to the window of the room where the hospital garden was visible. Mrs. Eleanor, would you like to take a little walk in the garden? It's a beautiful day outside. It's been weeks since I left this room. All the more reason. Sometimes a change of scenery helps change your thoughts too. Richard went to get a wheelchair and carefully helped his mother move from the bed. It was the first time she had moved voluntarily since being admitted. The four of them went down to the hospital garden together. It was late afternoon, and the sun cast a beautiful golden light through the trees. It's so lovely here, Mrs. Eleanor remarked, breathing in the fresh air. I always come here when I'm sad, JP said, pushing the wheelchair slowly along the paths between the plants. My grandmother used to say that nature teaches us everything has its time. A time to die, a time to be born, a time to suffer, a time to be happy. They sat on a bench near a small fountain. The sound of running water was soothing, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt at peace. JP, can I ask you about your father? Richard said. The boy stayed quiet for a moment, playing with a twig he'd picked up from the ground. He left when I was 8. I found out later he had another family in another city. JP spoke without bitterness in his voice. At first I was really angry. Then I was sad. Then I stopped feeling anything. And now? Now I understand he was confused too. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains it. JP looked at Mrs. Margaret. And I understand my mom did the work of 2 people to raise me. That's worth way more than having a father who didn't want to be here. Mrs. Margaret took her son's hand, moved. You should have never had to go through that, son. Maybe not. But if I hadn't, I wouldn't have learned how to help other people. JP smiled at her, and I wouldn't have met you all today. Richard watched the family and thought about how blind he'd been to so many things. He'd spent his whole life focused on making money and building his business empire, but had forgotten to build real human connections. "You know something?" Richard said. "I think we can all learn a lot from each other." "How so?" Mrs. Eleanor asked. "JP has an emotional wisdom I never developed. Mrs. Margaret has a strength and dignity I admire. And you, Mom, have a capacity to love that I'd forgotten to value." Richard paused. "Maybe we can keep meeting, even after you're better." "I'd like that very much," Mrs. Eleanor replied sincerely. "And I have an idea," JP said excitedly. "What if we started a group to help other people going through hard times, like we did today?" Richard smiled at the suggestion. "You mean using the techniques your grandmother taught you?" "Yeah, and using the resources you have, and the life experience Mrs. Eleanor has." JP was clearly excited about the idea. "I bet there are lots of people out there who just need someone to talk to." "Mrs." Margaret shook her head, proud of her son's generosity. "This boy always thinks of others." "It's a good quality," Mrs. Eleanor remarked. "The world needs more people like that." They spent another hour in the garden, talking about their lives, dreams, and fears. Richard learned that Mrs. Margaret had started working at 14 to help support her younger siblings, and had always dreamed of studying nursing. "It's never too late to chase a dream," Richard said, when she shared this old wish. "With 12 years raising a child alone?" Mrs. Margaret laughed without bitterness. "I think that dream's for another life." "What if it wasn't?" Richard insisted. "What if there was a way for you to study and still take care of JP?" "How?" "There are night classes, and I could hire someone to stay with JP on the nights you're studying." Mrs. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. "Mr. Richard, you've already done so much for us." "Truth is, I've barely done anything yet," Richard replied. "And this isn't charity. I'm investing in good people. It's different." JP looked at Richard with admiration. "You're really cool, you know that." "I'm learning to be," Richard laughed. "Thanks to you all." As it grew dark, they returned to Mrs. Eleanor's room. She looked noticeably more lively and alert than she had in weeks. "Dr. Henry's going to be surprised when he sees me like this tomorrow," she commented, referring to the doctor handling her case. "What will you tell him?" JP asked. "The truth, that sometimes the best medicine doesn't come from the pharmacy. It comes from people's hearts." Richard helped his mother settle into bed, but she didn't seem sleepy. "Son, can you bring me those documents I found in the attic?" Richard was surprised by the request. "Are you sure, Mom?" "I am. I think I need to read everything again, but this time without anger, just to understand." Richard promised he'd bring the documents the next day. "JP, can you come visit me tomorrow?" Mrs. Eleanor asked. "Of course, after school I'll come." The boy smiled. "And I'll bring my mom too." "Wonderful. I'd like to get to know both of you better." Mrs. Margaret and JP said their goodbyes and left together. Richard stayed a little longer with his mother. "How do you really feel, Mom?" "Different." She thought for a moment. "It still hurts, Richard. Knowing your father hid so much from me, it still hurts deeply. But today I learned I can carry that pain without letting it destroy me." "Did JP teach you that?" JP reminded me of something I already knew but had forgotten. Mrs. Eleanor held her son's hand. "That our worth doesn't depend on the mistakes others make. It depends on how we choose to respond to those mistakes." Richard kissed his mother's forehead. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, son, and I'm proud of you." "Why?" "Because today you chose to be the man I always knew you could be." Richard left the hospital with a heart lighter than it had been in months. For the first time since discovering the documents about his father, he felt there was a way forward. The next day, Richard arrived at the hospital with a folder containing all the documents his mother had found. He also brought some information he'd gathered overnight about his unknown half-brother. Mrs. Eleanor was sitting in the armchair beside the bed, wearing her own clothes instead of the hospital gown. "You look wonderful, Mom." "I feel much better." She smiled. "Dr. Henry came to see me this morning and said I can be discharged tomorrow if I keep improving like this." "That's great news." "And you? Did you find anything about your brother?" Richard sat beside his mother and opened the folder. "I did. His name is Paul Henry Anderson. He's 38 and lives in Milwaukee." He paused. He works as a history teacher at a public school. Mrs. Eleanor fell silent, processing the information. A history teacher. And he has 2 daughters. Your granddaughters, Mom. Tears began to roll down Mrs. Eleanor's face. Granddaughters I've never met. Granddaughters you can still meet if you want. Mrs. Eleanor read through all the documents carefully, including some old letters her husband had written to the other woman. This time, however, she wasn't reading with anger but trying to understand the context of that time. You know what hurts me the most, Richard? What? It's not even the betrayal. It's the fact that he never gave me the chance to know Paul. She folded one of the letters carefully. Maybe I could have loved that boy like a son. Maybe he could have been a brother to you. Richard was surprised by his mother's reaction. You really feel that way? I do. Children aren't to blame for their parents' mistakes. Mrs. Eleanor looked at Richard. And if JP taught me anything yesterday, it's that love doesn't shrink when it's shared. It only grows. Just then, JP and Mrs. Margaret arrived at the room. Good afternoon, JP greeted cheerfully. How did you sleep last night? Very well, dear. And you? My mum slept through the night for the first time in months. JP smiled. I think not worrying about rent did her good. Mrs. Margaret was carrying a small bag. I brought a few things I thought you might like, she said shyly. What things? Mrs. Margaret pulled out a small vase with yellow flowers. They're daisies. I grew them on my windowsill. She hesitated. And I also brought a CD with those old songs you liked to listen to when I cleaned the room. Mrs. Eleanor was visibly moved. Margaret, you didn't have to. I wanted to do something to repay your kindness. Richard helped place the flowers where they'd catch the sun and turned on the room's sound system to play the CD. Soon the space was filled with Frank Sinatra's voice singing Sentimental Journey. This song, Mrs. Eleanor closed her eyes, smiling. Your father used to sing this to me when we were dating. JP moved closer to her. Is it a good memory? Yes, a very good one. Then it's still yours, no matter what happened after. Mrs. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at the boy affectionately. You're right. No one can take our good memories from us. Richard watched the scene, impressed by how JP always found the right words to help his mother process her emotions. Mom, I need to tell you something, Richard said. I tried reaching out to Paul yesterday. Mrs. Eleanor turned to him, surprised. And did you? I managed to speak to him on the phone. Richard took a deep breath. He said he always knew about us. His mother told him when he was already an adult. What else did he say? That he always wanted to meet you, and me too. Richard held his mother's hand. He said his mother always spoke of you with great respect, that Dad used to tell her things about you. Mrs. Eleanor was silent for a moment. He wants to meet us. Yes, and he said his daughters always ask about their father's family. What did you say? That I needed to talk to you first, that the decision was yours. JP gently interjected. Can I give my opinion? Of course, sweetheart. I think everyone deserves a chance to know their family, even if it's late. JP thought for a moment, and maybe Paul is hurting too. After all, he lost his father and never got to share that grief with you. The boy's observation made everyone reflect. You're right, Mrs. Eleanor finally said. Richard, call him. Invite him and the girls to come here. Are you sure? I am. It's time to stop running from the past and start building a future. Richard stepped out to make the call, and JP stayed talking with Mrs. Eleanor. Are you scared? A little, she admitted. What if he doesn't like me? What if the girls think I'm strange? No one could possibly not like you, JP said sincerely. You have such a good heart. People feel that. Mrs. Margaret approached. Mrs. Eleanor, can I tell you something? Of course. When I cleaned your room before all this happened, I always noticed how kind you were to me. You always greeted me, always thanked me. Mrs. Margaret smiled. Most patients don't even notice we exist, but you always treated me like a person. Because you are a good one. That's why I know Paul and his daughters will adore you, because you treat everyone well, no matter who they are. Richard returned to the room a few minutes later. Well, Mrs. Eleanor asked anxiously, Paul is coming tomorrow with his daughters. Richard smiled. He said he can hardly wait to meet you. What are the girls like? Anna Louise is 15 and Beatrice is 12, the same age as JP. Richard glanced at the boy. Maybe you'll become friends. JP smiled at the possibility. It'd be cool to have new cousins. Cousins? Mrs. Eleanor asked. Of course. If Paul is Mr. Richard's brother and Mr. Richard is already kind of family, then the girls are my cousins too, JP explained with a child's simple logic. Richard laughed at how easily JP had included everyone in one big extended family. I think you're right, JP. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The next day, Mrs. Eleanor was discharged from the hospital but decided to return to meet Paul and his daughters. Richard had suggested they meet in a more neutral and comfortable setting. They gathered in the hospital garden on the same bench where they had talked on the first day. Mrs. Eleanor was nervous, but JP stood by her side for support. When Paul arrived with his daughters, the first moment was silent. He was a tall, slender man with graying hair and kind eyes. The girls hid shyly behind their father. Mrs. Eleanor, Paul said, stepping forward slowly. Paul, she replied, rising from her chair. The two looked at each other for a few seconds, searching for similarities and differences. Paul had features reminiscent of Richard's father, but his expression was gentler. It's an honor to finally meet you, Paul said, extending his hand. Mrs. Eleanor surprised him by opening her arms for a hug. You're my husband's son. That makes you my son too. Paul was moved by her warmth and returned the embrace. I've always dreamed of this moment, he said softly. So have I. Without even knowing I was dreaming, she replied. Richard watched, touched, while JP approached the girls to break the ice. Hi, I'm Jack Peter, but everyone calls me JP. You must be Anna Louise and Beatrice. Anna Louise, the older one, answered shyly. Hi, it's weird meeting a family we didn't know existed. It really is, JP agreed, but sometimes the best surprises in life are the ones we never saw coming. Beatrice, who was JP's age, seemed more curious. Do you live here in Chicago? Yeah, in Hope Village. And you live in Milwaukee? Yes, Dad teaches at our school. That's cool. What does he teach? History, Anna Louise answered. He always tells really interesting stories about the past. JP looked at Paul with interest. You must know a lot about family then, Paul smiled at the boy. A few things. What about you, JP? Do you study history too? Not much in school, but I learn a lot from life, JP replied with his usual honesty. As the children talked, Mrs. Eleanor sat beside Paul. Tell me about your mother. What was she like? Paul hesitated for a moment. Mrs. Eleanor, I don't want to hurt you. You won't. I want to understand how everything happened. My mother was a nurse. She worked at the same hospital as my father, Paul began slowly. She was never bitter toward you. She always said you were a good woman and that my father loved you very much. Even knowing the situation? She said the human heart is complicated, that sometimes we can love two people at once, each in a different way. Paul looked at Mrs. Eleanor. I'm not saying it was right. I'm just telling you how she explained it to me. Mrs. Eleanor grew thoughtful. Is your mother still alive? She passed away 5 years ago, cancer. I'm so sorry. Thank you. Before she left, she made me promise I'd try to meet you someday. She said it was important for the girls to know their whole family. Richard joined the conversation. Paul, I have to tell you something. When we found out about you, our first reaction was anger. I can imagine. But now I understand you were also a victim of the situation. You grew up without knowing half your family. That's true. I've always felt incomplete in some way. JP, who had been listening closely, stepped forward. You know what I think, he said. I think sometimes the bad things that happen can turn into good things in the end. How so? Paul asked. If you'd met when you were younger, maybe you wouldn't value this moment as much. JP reflected. Sometimes we only understand the value of something when we almost lose it. Anna Louise looked at the boy with admiration. You talk like an adult. It's just that I've been through some tough things. They taught me how to think. Beatrice approached Mrs. Eleanor. Can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. Are you mad at our grandfather? The girl's direct question took Mrs. Eleanor by surprise. She thought for a moment before answering. I'm sad about some choices he made, but I'm not angry anymore. Why? Because I realized staying angry doesn't change what already happened. It just keeps us from enjoying the good things that can happen now. Beatrice smiled. My dad always says that too, that we can't change the past, but we can choose the future. Your father is a wise man. Paul was moved hearing that. Actually, I learned that from my daughters. They taught me family isn't just about blood, it's a choice. Richard watched the whole interaction, impressed by how naturally the meeting was flowing. How about we all have lunch together? He suggested. I know a nearby restaurant where we can talk more comfortably. Great idea, Mrs. Eleanor agreed. And I want Margaret and JP to come too. They're part of this family now. Mrs. Margaret, who had just arrived and was watching from a distance to not intrude, was surprised to be included. Mrs. Eleanor, we don't want to interrupt the family reunion. You're not interrupting. You are family. Paul looked curiously at Richard, who quickly explained how they'd met JP and Mrs. Margaret, and how the boy had helped Mrs. Eleanor recover. Amazing, Paul remarked. So it was JP who gave us this chance to meet. How so? JP asked. If you hadn't helped Mrs. Eleanor, she'd still be in the hospital, not talking to anyone, and we'd never have met. JP thought for a moment. That's true. Things really are all connected. Anna Louise moved closer to JP. Can you teach me the things your grandmother taught you? Of course. What do you want to learn for? I have a friend at school who's going through some problems at home. Her parents are separating and she's really sad. JP smiled. The first thing my grandmother taught me is that we should never try to solve other people's problems. We can only help them find their own solutions. And how do you do that? By listening, really listening, and asking questions that help them think. Beatrice was also interested in the conversation. What kind of questions? For example, instead of saying everything will be fine, ask, how are you feeling? Instead of giving advice, ask, what do you think you can do? Richard watched, fascinated, as JP explained complex ideas so simply even children understood. They walked together to the restaurant, and over lunch the conversations flowed naturally. Paul talked about his work as a teacher, Anna Louise shared her dream of becoming a doctor, and Beatrice revealed she wanted to be a psychologist. Why a psychologist? JP asked. Because I want to help people who are sad like JP does. That's a beautiful profession, Mrs. Margaret commented. I always wanted to study, but I never had the chance. What field? Paul asked, interested. Nursing, but it's too late now. It's never too late to study, Paul insisted. I have some students at school who are over 50. They went back to fulfill old dreams. Richard joined the conversation. Actually, Margaret, I already enrolled you in a nursing technician course. It starts next month. Mrs. Margaret nearly dropped her water glass. What do you mean? I looked into it yesterday and found an excellent night program. 3 years and you'll be certified. Richard smiled. And it's already paid for. Mrs. Margaret began to cry, and JP hugged his mother. Mom, you deserve this. You've always taken care of everyone else. Now it's time to take care of your dreams too. Mrs. Eleanor was moved by the scene. Richard, I'm so proud of you. I learned from all of you that money only has value when it's used to do good. Paul looked at Richard with respect. You're right. And you know what? I think our father would be proud to see how much you've grown. Even after all the mistakes he made? Especially because of them, Paul replied. Because you learned from his mistakes and chose to be better. The conversation was interrupted when Anna Louise asked a question that left everyone thoughtful. So now what? What will our family look like? Richard, Mrs. Eleanor, Paul, and the girls exchanged glances, realizing they really needed to decide how this newly discovered family would function. Well, Mrs. Eleanor said thoughtfully, I think we can start slow. Phone calls, visits now and then. And vacations together, Beatrice suggested excitedly. Daddy always said family needs to spend time together to truly know each other. JP, who had been listening to everything, had an idea. What if we started that project we talked about? He looked at Richard. Helping other families going through tough times? What kind of project? Paul asked, intrigued. Richard explained the idea they had discussed, using the techniques JP had learned from his grandmother, combined with financial resources to help people in difficult situations. It's an amazing idea, Paul commented, and as a teacher, I can contribute on the educational side. A lot of families struggle because they don't know how to talk to each other. Anna Louise brightened at the possibility. And I can help with research. I'm doing a school project on social issues. And I can help understand how kids feel when their parents are fighting, Beatrice added. Mrs. Margaret, still emotional about the news of her course, also wanted to contribute. Once I graduate as a nurse, I can take care of the health side for these families. JP looked at everyone, visibly happy to see how his idea was bringing this newly formed family together. My grandma always said the best medicines are love and attention, he remarked. If we combine that with knowledge and resources, we can help a lot of people. Mrs. Eleanor, who had been quietly listening to everyone's suggestions, finally spoke. You know what? I think your father, our husband and father, would have liked to see something good come out of all this mess. How so? Richard asked. If he hadn't had that affair, Paul would never have been born, the girls wouldn't exist, and we never would have met. She paused. I'm not saying what he did was right, but sometimes even mistakes can lead to good things if we let them. Paul took Mrs. Eleanor's hand. Thank you for accepting me as your son. Thank you for accepting me as your mother. Richard watched the scene, moved, thinking about how his life had completely changed in just a few days. He had discovered a family he never knew existed, learned the true value of helping others, and seen his mother recover in a way no doctor could explain. JP, Richard said, I want you to know you've changed my life. Actually, we changed each other's lives, JP replied wisely. Sometimes it's like that. You think you're helping someone, but you're being helped too. That's true, Anna Louise agreed. I was sad because I felt our family was incomplete. Now I've found out it's bigger than I ever imagined. Beatrice looked at JP with admiration. You're really smart. I want to be your friend. We're already friends, JP smiled. We're cousins too, remember? The afternoon flew by quickly with everyone sharing stories, dreams, and plans. When it was time for Paul and the girls to return to Milwaukee, they were all reluctant to part ways. How about you come spend next weekend here? Richard suggested. We could start planning that project to help families. We'd love to, Paul replied. And you can visit us in Milwaukee too. The girls want to show you the school where I work. And I want to see the city where my brother lives, Richard said, still getting used to the word brother. Before saying goodbye, Mrs. Eleanor called Paul aside for a private conversation. Paul, I want you to know I hold no resentment toward your mother. Paul was surprised. Really? Really? In fact, I'd like to visit her grave someday, to thank her for raising such a good son. Paul was deeply moved. That would mean a lot to me, and it would mean a lot to me too. She was part of our family's story, even if I didn't know it at the time. After Paul and the girls left, Richard, Mrs. Eleanor, JP, and Mrs. Margaret stayed in the hospital garden, talking about everything that had happened. I can't believe it's only been 3 days since we met, Mrs. Eleanor remarked. It feels like you've been part of my life for years. That's because some people come into our lives to stay, JP explained. My grandmother used to say you recognize them by how you feel around them, like you've known them from somewhere before. Mrs. Margaret looked at her son with pride. This boy is my greatest treasure. And now he's a treasure to all of us, Richard said sincerely. When it was time to leave, Richard offered Mrs. Margaret and JP a ride to Hope Village. I'd like to see where you live, he said. The drive to Hope Village was eye-opening for Richard. He'd never been to that part of town before and was struck by the simplicity of the homes and the strong sense of community. Here it is, JP pointed to a small but well-kept house with a few plants on the porch. Richard parked and they got out. The house was modest but clean and tidy. Mrs. Margaret had managed to create a warm home despite limited means. It's really nice here, Richard said honestly. Thank you, Mrs. Margaret smiled. It's humble, but it's our home. JP showed Richard the little garden he tended in the backyard. This is where my grandmother taught me about plants. She said caring for something that grows teaches patience and hope. Richard crouched to get a closer look. They're very well taken care of. JP has a green thumb, Mrs. Margaret said proudly, and a gift for caring for people too. A neighbor approached the fence separating the yards. Margaret, everything all right? I saw you arrived by car. Everything's fine, Mrs. Rose. This is Mr. Richard, a friend of ours. Mrs. Rose, a white-haired woman with a kind smile, greeted Richard curiously. Nice to meet you. Margaret and JP are the best neighbors anyone could ask for. How so? Richard asked. When my husband was sick, JP came by every day after school to keep him company. And Margaret always brought food when I couldn't cook. Richard looked at JP with admiration. You never told me that. It's no big deal, JP shrugged, just being neighborly. Mrs. Rose continued, and when JP found out I couldn't read well, he started teaching me. Now I can even read the newspaper. Richard was amazed. JP didn't just apply his grandmother's lessons in dramatic situations like his mother's, he used them every day, helping ordinary people with small but meaningful acts. JP, you're extraordinary. I'm not, the boy replied simply. I just do what feels right. Mrs. Rose said her goodbyes and returned home. Richard, Mrs. Margaret and JP sat on the porch to continue talking. Margaret, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you hold any resentment toward JP's father? Mrs. Margaret took a moment before answering. At first I did, a lot. I was furious when he left us alone. She glanced at JP. But my son taught me something important. What? That staying stuck in the past only kept me from enjoying the present. And the present I have with JP is very good. What about you, JP? Richard asked. Are you angry at your father? JP shook his head. Sometimes I feel sad thinking about how things might have been if he'd stayed. But my grandmother explained that everyone has their own journey. Sometimes paths cross for a while. Sometimes they separate. It doesn't mean the love wasn't real. The maturity in the boy's words still amazed Richard. Your grandmother really was a special person. She was, but she always said we could all be special if we choose to be. When Richard left, it was already night. He returned to his penthouse in the upscale neighborhood, but for the first time in a long while, the luxury around him brought no joy. His thoughts lingered on the warm simplicity of JP and Mrs. Margaret's home, and how rich they were in things money couldn't buy. The next day, Richard visited his mother, who had returned home. How do you feel being back? Good, but different, Mrs. Eleanor replied. It's like I'm seeing everything with new eyes. How so? All these expensive things, all these privileges. They didn't bring back my ability to speak when I lost it. What did that was a 12-year-old boy with a huge heart. Richard nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. I've been thinking, Mom. What if we changed the way we live? How? What if we used our home, our resources, to really make a difference in people's lives? He sat beside her. We could turn part of the house into a center where JP can teach his techniques, where you can share your life experience, where Paul can give lessons, Mrs. Eleanor smiled, and where Margaret can practice nursing once she graduates. Exactly. And where Anna Louise and Beatrice can learn firsthand how to help others. You really want to do this? I do. For the first time in my life, I want to do something that truly matters. Mrs. Eleanor hugged her son. Then let's do it. In the days that followed, Richard began putting the plan into action. He consulted architects about remodeling part of the house to create spaces for families. He researched regulations for social assistance organizations. And most of all, he spent time with JP, learning more about the techniques the boy had inherited from his grandmother. The first thing my grandmother taught me, JP explained as they walked through the park near Richard's home, is that you can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped. And the second is that everyone has the answers to their own problems inside them. We just help them find those answers. How do you do that? By asking the right questions. and most importantly by listening to the answers without judgment. Richard was learning that helping people was far more complex than just giving money. It required time, patience, and above all, the ability to genuinely connect with another's pain. The following weekend, Paul, Anna Louise, and Beatrice came to Chicago as planned. This time they stayed at Richard's house, marking the first time the entire family had gathered under one roof. "It's strange how at home we feel here," Anna Louise remarked during dinner. "That's what family is," Mrs. Eleanor replied. "A place where you feel at home." "And now we're a big family," Beatrice said, looking around the table where Richard, Mrs. Eleanor, Paul, herself, Anna Louise, JP, and Mrs. Margaret were seated. "It's true," JP agreed, "and the best part is that each of us brings something special to the group." During that weekend, they began to concretely plan their family assistance project. Paul suggested starting small, perhaps helping one family a month to learn from the experience before expanding. "We can begin with families going through situations similar to ours," Anna Louise proposed. "Separations, painful discoveries, communication problems, and financial struggles too," Mrs. Margaret added. "Often people can't resolve emotional issues because they're too worried about basic needs." Richard was impressed by how everyone had valuable ideas to contribute. "You know what?" he said. "I think this project could become something much bigger than we imagined." "How so?" Paul asked. "I believe we can create a new model for social assistance, one that combines financial resources with emotional support, education, and healthcare," Richard said, excited by the possibilities. "A place where families don't just receive help, but learn to help others too." JP smiled. "My grandmother would be proud. She always said knowledge only has value when it's shared." That night, while everyone slept, Richard stayed awake, thinking about how his life had completely changed. Just a week ago, he was a successful but lonely businessman, focused only on making money. Now he had a large, diverse family, a greater purpose in life, and had discovered that true wealth lay in human connections. On Monday, after Paul and the girls returned to Milwaukee, Richard, JP, and Mrs. Margaret went to Mercy General Hospital to thank the medical team who had cared for Mrs. Eleanor. "Dr. Henry, I'd like to introduce the people responsible for my mother's recovery," Richard said to the lead physician. The doctor looked at JP curiously. "Is this the boy your mother spoke so much about?" "Yes, Jack Peter was the one who truly healed my mother." The doctor crouched to JP's eye level. "Young man, your mother told me about the techniques you used. I'd love to learn more." JP was surprised. "Really? Really? We doctors learn a lot about the body, but sometimes we forget about the soul," the doctor said with a smile. "Could you teach some of our psychologists?" Richard looked at JP, who was clearly excited by the idea. "JP, what do you think? I think my grandmother would be happy knowing her teachings could help more people." And so JP began visiting the hospital regularly, no longer just the son of an employee, but as a young consultant, teaching emotional healing techniques to the medical staff. Meanwhile, Mrs. Margaret started her nursing classes. On the first day, she was nervous about being older than most of her classmates, but soon realized her life experience was actually an advantage. "How was your first class?" JP asked when she got home. "Amazing," Mrs. Margaret beamed. "The instructor said students with real-life experience often make the best nurses because they truly understand suffering." "My grandmother always said that," JP replied. "Those who have suffered are better at helping others who are suffering." A few weeks later, they received their first official case, a family referred by the hospital, where the mother was depressed after losing her job and the father didn't know how to handle the situation. "I'm nervous," Richard admitted before meeting the family. "What if we can't help them?" "We will," JP said confidently, "because we're not trying to solve their problems for them. We're just offering support so they can solve their own problems." The family was named Sullivan, Charles, Marilyn, and their children, Peter, 15 years old, and Lucy, 8 years old. They went to Richard's house, where a special space had already been set up to welcome families. Marilyn was visibly depressed, avoiding eye contact and speaking very little. Charles seemed exhausted and stressed. The children were quiet and tense. JP approached Lucy first, as she was closer to his age. "Hi Lucy, I'm JP. Do you like our house?" The girl nodded timidly. "It's really big." "It is. Sometimes it's too big." JP smiled. "But do you know what my favorite part is?" "What?" "The garden. Want to see?" While JP took Lucy to see the garden, Anna Louise, who had come for the weekend, approached Peter. "It must be hard seeing your parents so sad." She said it directly. Peter looked at her, surprised someone would get straight to the point. "Yeah, I don't know how to help them." "Sometimes we can't help. We can just be there." Meanwhile, Mrs. Eleanor was talking with Marilyn and Richard was speaking with Charles. Paul, who had come especially for this first experience, observed everything to learn. "Marilyn," Mrs. Eleanor said gently, "can I tell you something that happened to me recently?" Marilyn nodded. "A few weeks ago, I found out something that hurt me deeply. Something about my husband that changed everything I thought about my life." Mrs. Eleanor spoke calmly. "I was so devastated that I stopped speaking, moving, living." Marilyn looked at her with interest, recognizing something familiar in the story. "And how did you get through it?" "A 12-year-old boy taught me that we can choose what to do with our pain. We can let it destroy us or we can use it to understand life better." "But it's hard," Marilyn said, the first words she'd spoken since arriving. "It's really hard," Mrs. Eleanor agreed. "But it's also possible." Meanwhile, Richard was talking with Charles. "I know what it's like to feel responsible for fixing everything alone," Richard said. "How would you know?" Charles asked defensively. "You have money. You don't struggle." "You're right. I don't struggle financially," Richard admitted. "But I've struggled emotionally. I spent my whole life thinking money fixed everything until I realized it didn't fix what really mattered." Charles relaxed a little, seeing Richard wasn't trying to downplay his problems. "So what really matters? Connection, family, purpose." Richard paused, and most of all not carrying the weight of the world alone. In the garden, JP was teaching Lucy about the plants. "See this rose?" He pointed to one just beginning to bloom. 3 weeks ago, it was just a dry bud. Looked like it was dying. And what happened? I took care of it, gave it water, sunlight, attention. And look at it now. Lucy studied the rose, which was indeed flourishing. "Sometimes people are like plants," JP continued. "When they're going through hard times, they need care to bloom again." "Do you think my mom can bloom again?" "I'm sure of it. She just needs time and people who care about her." After a few hours of conversation, the Sullivan family left, but with a different expression than when they'd arrived. Marilyn was speaking more. Charles seemed less tense, and the children were more relaxed. "How do you think it went?" Richard asked the group once they were alone. "I think we planted some seeds," JP answered. "Now we need patience to see if they'll grow." "And if they don't?" Anna Louise asked. "Then we learn from the experience and try something different next time," Paul said. "The important thing is to try." Mrs. Margaret, who had just arrived from college during the Sullivan family's visit, added, "In school, I learned that healing is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes years. But at least they know now they're not alone," Mrs. Eleanor observed, "and that's already a start." In the following days, Richard stayed in touch with the Sullivan family. Charles managed to get a temporary job through a referral Richard had arranged, which eased some of their financial pressure. Marilyn began attending a support group for people with depression, something she had resisted before. "You know what amazes me the most?" Richard remarked to JP a week later. "Helping them makes me feel better too. My grandmother used to say that when you give, you always receive something back, not necessarily from the same person, but from somewhere. It's true. I feel more useful now than I ever did running a $1 million company." JP smiled. "Maybe because now you're doing something that truly matters." A month later, they had their first big surprise. The Sullivan family came back to visit, but this time they brought another family going through similar struggles. "We wanted to repay the help we received," Marilyn explained. "This is the Olivers family. They're in a situation like ours." Richard glanced at JP, both realizing something bigger was happening. The people they'd helped were starting to help others. "That's how it works," JP whispered to Richard. "Goodness spreads on its own." The Olivers became the second official case of the project, And just like with the Sullivans, the process of helping them taught everyone involved so much. A few months later, the project had already helped 5 families, and some of them had even become volunteers, assisting other families who came after. "I think we've created something special here," Paul remarked during a project review meeting. "Actually," JP said thoughtfully, "I think we just let something happen that was already natural. People have always wanted to help each other. They just needed an opportunity and a little guidance." Richard looked around the room at his extended family, his mother, his newly discovered brother, his nieces JP, Mrs. Margaret, now in her 2nd year of nursing school, and some members of the families they'd helped who had become regulars in the group. "JP," Richard said, "I want you to know that day in the hospital when you approached me was the day my real life began." "Actually, Uncle Richard, I think it was the day all our real lives began." Mrs. Eleanor stood and hugged JP. "Thank you, my dear, for teaching me it's never too late to discover who we really are." And so, what had started as a chance encounter between a desperate businessman and a wise boy grew into something much bigger. A new kind of family, a new way of helping, and most of all, a new way of living. Months later, Richard was back at his company, but now he ran things differently. Part of the profits went to the Family Assistance Project, and he had implemented emotional support programs for his own employees. "Mr. Richard," his secretary interrupted, "JP is here to see you." JP walked into the office, impressed by the size and the view from the window. "Wow, you can see the whole city from here." "Yeah, but you know the best view I've discovered lately?" "What?" "The sight of your smile when you help someone." JP laughed. "You're getting sentimental." "I am, and I'm not ashamed of it." JP sat in the chair across from Richard's desk. "I came to share some news." "What is it?" "My mom is graduating in 6 months, and the hospital offered her a job as soon as she graduates." "That's fantastic news, and there's more." JP smiled. "Mrs. Eleanor spoke to the school principal, and they want to create a program where I teach emotional support techniques to other students." Richard was moved to see how everything was falling into place. "And you, what do you think of all this?" JP grew thoughtful for a moment. "Sometimes I think about my grandmother and wonder if she knew her teachings would go this far." "I'm sure she did," Richard said. "Wise people like your grandmother always know the good they do will multiply." "I think so too," JP agreed. "And I think she'd be happy to know we proved that family isn't just who you're born with, it's who chooses to stay with you." Richard looked out the window, seeing the city below, and thought about how his perspective had changed. Before, he only saw buildings and cars. Now he saw people, families, stories, possibilities for connection and help. "JP, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you regret approaching me that day?" JP smiled. "Never. My grandmother always said that when you follow your heart, things always work out. Maybe not the way you expected, but they do." "And do you think it worked out?" JP glanced around the office, then looked at Richard. "Are you happy?" "Happier than I ever imagined I could be." Then it worked out. In that moment, Richard realized JP had given him much more than a way to help his mother. He'd given him a new way to live, a new definition of success, and most of all, a new family. A few months later, on the project's first anniversary, they organized a big gathering with all the families they'd helped, families who were now helping others. Richard's house was full of life, children running in the garden, adults laughing and talking, elders sharing stories. It was the kind of energy the house had never known before. "Look at this," Mrs. Eleanor said to Richard, watching the scene in the garden. "A year ago, I was mute in a hospital. You were alone in this huge house, and JP was worried about saving his family. And now? Now we have a family that includes half of Chicago." She laughed. "And it all started with a brave boy who approached a stranger and offered help." Richard saw JP in the middle of the garden, surrounded by children of all ages, teaching them about plants. Some were daughters of families the project had helped. Others were Anna Louise and Beatrice, who now spent every weekend in Chicago. "JP," Richard called, "come here a second." The boy walked over, now 14, but still carrying the same serene wisdom that defined him. "What is it, Uncle Richard?" "I just want to thank you for everything." "No need to thank me." JP smiled. "We did it all together." "True, but you were the one brave enough to start it." JP looked around at all the happy faces in the garden. "You know what my grandmother would say if she were here?" "What?" "That sometimes a tiny seed can grow into a whole forest. It just needs the right soil." Richard hugged JP, moved. "Thank you for teaching me I could be the right soil. And thank you for teaching me I could be the seed." As they embraced, Mrs. Margaret approached. She wore her new nurse's uniform, having graduated the week before. "My two favorite men," she said, hugging them both. "How was your first official day at the hospital?" Richard asked. "Amazing," Mrs. Margaret beamed. "And you know the first thing I did?" "What?" "I hummed softly while caring for patients, just like I did when I worked in cleaning." She laughed. "Some doctors found it odd, but the patients loved it." JP laughed too. "Some things shouldn't change even when we move up in life." "Exactly," Mrs. Margaret agreed. "The profession may have changed, but the care for people remains the same." At that moment, Paul approached with Anna Louise and Beatrice. "Family," he called. "Time for the project's anniversary photo." Everyone gathered in the garden for the picture. Richard, Mrs. Eleanor, Paul, Anna Louise, Beatrice, JP, Mrs. Margaret, and many others who had become part of their extended family through the project. "Wait," JP said before the photo was taken. "There's something I want to say." Everyone listened. "My grandmother always said love is the only thing that grows when it's shared." JP looked around at the gathered faces. "Looking at all of you today, I finally understand what she meant." "JP," Anna Louise said, "you're still the wisest cousin in the world." "And you're still the cleverest," JP replied with a smile. The photo was taken, capturing a moment of pure happiness and connection. Later, when everyone had left and the house fell quiet again, Richard, Mrs. Eleanor and JP stayed in the garden talking. "You know what?" Richard said. "I think we've discovered the secret to happiness." "What is it?" JP asked. "It's simple. When we stop worrying only about our own lives and start caring about others, our own lives automatically get better." Mrs. Eleanor nodded. "And we've learned that family isn't about blood. It's about choice, care, and love." JP looked up at the starry sky. "I think my grandmother is happy up there, seeing how her lessons have spread." "I'm sure she is," Richard said. "And I'm sure she's proud of you." "Actually," JP corrected, "I think she's proud of all of us." And she was, because what had started as a desperate meeting between a businessman and a boy had grown into something far greater. Proof that love, compassion, and wisdom could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Years later, the project had expanded to other cities. Paul had written a book about the techniques they'd developed. Anna Louise had become a doctor and implemented their methods in her hospital. Beatrice had become a psychologist and created similar programs in schools. Mrs. Margaret had become a nursing supervisor, known for her compassionate approach to patient care. And JP had grown into a young man who still lived by his grandmother's teachings, now helping not just families in crisis, but also training other young people to do the same. Richard still ran his company, but in a completely different way. He'd introduced emotional wellness programs for employees, created funds to support staff in need, and made social responsibility a priority. But most importantly, he'd learned that true success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you share. And by sharing his wealth, his experience, and above all, his time and attention, he'd gained something no money could buy: a large, diverse family bound by genuine love. And it had all started with a simple phrase, spoken by a brave boy in a hospital hallway. "I can heal your mother, but first, you need to save mine." Sometimes the biggest transformations begin with the smallest gestures. Sometimes those who need help the most are in the best position to give it. And sometimes saving someone else is the way to save yourself too. The end. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments if you believe small gestures can truly change lives, just as they did for Richard and JP. Your opinion means a lot to us. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories. Thank you for your company.